we do have another question from Google, which asks, do you not think that millennial debt is forcing this delayed homeownership trend? So what might we need to sort of address the debt burden of millennials?
Yeah. Well, if you go to uli.org and search for Gen Y and housing, you can find the whole Gen Y and housing report, which includes some information about millennials and student loan debt, and it's certainly a part of the picture. You can't deny that the amount of in particular student loan debt has something to do with it. But it seems like student loan debt has always and regularly been a problem. I mean, Gen X didn't exactly get out of college scot-free, so maybe there's a bit of a delay during those payback years, but it's not the full answer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And certainly here in...
Go ahead,
Hello?
Nicole.
Okay, sorry. In here in Rhode Island, we did some analysis of renter households by age, and for renters between the ages of 18 and 25, their housing cost burden is very pronounced here in Rhode Island. I'm going to look at my infographic, but 59% of renter households between the ages of 18 and 24 are actually cost burden, and 37% are severely cost burden, spending more than half of their income on housing. So if you already are sort of behind the 8 ball as a young renter fresh out of college, or perhaps just entering the workforce, then it's going to be a lot harder then to be able to save your money to perhaps invest in home ownership later on.
Corrie, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would add, from other surveys, I've done a fair amount of work with millennials, and student debt really always comes up as one of their top concerns, one of their top issues, especially for college grads and current college students. So I think that might be an obstacle from their perspective, but the other thing I would add is wages, and stagnant wages is something that comes up repeatedly, that the cost of housing is going up at a much higher rate than their wages are, and so people, at least young people, are feeling overwhelmed by making their payments for their debt, for their college debt, and then also earning enough money to be able to afford a bigger mortgage. Mm-hmm. So I think there are several things going on, at least from the millennials' perspective.
Mm-hmm. And sort of teeing off of that a little bit, some of the work that Corrie and her colleagues have done as part of the Housing Matters survey sees that on the sort of relationship between housing and economic mobility, that the lack of economic mobility or social mobility people feel is possible is very much connected to housing. And so one of the questions that I wanted to ask our panel is, how can housers, quote unquote, think about working with other groups and efforts that are focused on economic opportunity to advance efforts around expanding affordable housing options? So how can housing and those groups that are working on income and economic opportunity really work together? So just want to open it up to Maya, Corrie, Ethan, Howard, Nicole. Somebody jump in.
Yeah. Well, the working together is always hard. There's always the first step of trying to figure out, like, the language of the other field. Who are the partners you should be working with in the other field? How do you work together? How do you get past those initial humps? And there are some particular clear entry points for housing and folks who are working on economic opportunities and income growth to work together. And the Family Self-Sufficiency Program from HUD, a very small kind of boutique program that it's the little engine that could, where one day maybe it'll grow, but it's a great place for a public housing authority to partner with a local nonprofit that does a lot of workforce development work and does financial education for a low-income population, to really support HUD and support the public housing authority and their residents in increasing their assets, and using that having the nonprofit partner be able to bring financial education and bring educational opportunities for adults to the table, while it ends up being kind of paired with this match savings account on the other side, it's a really clear example of both sides really contributing. And there's certainly other cases in other ways, and housing organizations, housing developers from the nonprofit side that have gotten AFI grants, Assets for Independence Program grants, to do match savings accounts called IDAs. But there's always this learning hurdle that you have to go through first, and trying to find the right partner sometimes just takes looking across the hall, and sometimes is a lot harder.
Anyone else on our panel want to weigh in on that question?
I would love to. I'm really glad that Maya brought up the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, because that's actually poised to expand beyond the public housing system. In recent legislative authorization, HUD has the ability to allow private owners, be they for-profit or nonprofit, to participate in the program. They don't get funding for it, but they can allow their residents who are in subsidized housing to create those same sort of savings accounts and use the same program parameters that the public housing authorities have been able to use. So that creates a real possibility. Two other things I'd highlight very quickly. One is the role of housing counselors. That these are folks who their work really expanded during the foreclosure crisis. So there were a lot of families in need all at once, and we had to help them figure out their options. And housing counseling, especially by nonprofits, was seen as the obvious means to do that. Really, their work has potential to be much broader. It's about financial literacy and savings help, and folks like the NeighborWorks Network are really starting to explore those avenues, and I think that offers a lot of promise. The last point I'd highlight simply is that housing itself is a savings program, especially if it's through home ownership. That a home loan is the one leveraged means of investing that most households have, right? We think about large financial companies as able to make leveraged investments where they borrow to invest and therefore can magnify their returns. Well, when you borrow to buy a home, and if the home appreciates in value, that's a leveraged investment. It's a way to really save more and earn more if everything works out properly. Obviously, the recent events in the financial and housing sector have shown us that it's not a one-way bet, right? There's risk involved, and you need to plan appropriately for it. But over the long term, if an investment in homeownership combines a regular savings plan with a leveraged investment in a way that most American households don't have any other access to, right? You can't do that in the stock market. You can't do that with your retirement account, but you can do that with your home purchase. So to go back to the student debt point, if we worry that other debts are delaying people's entry into home ownership, it's a double whammy. Not only are they not getting the benefits of home ownership on the consumption side, right, that they're living in a home in a place they prefer to live, but they're also delaying their savings and their leveraged investment. And that's a real challenge. So a couple more things to highlight.
Great, thanks, Ethan. Go ahead, Nicole.
From the communications perspective, in Rhode Island, we work really hard at HousingWorks to have non-housers talk about housing. So that is why we started, for example, looking at Latinos in housing specifically. So then our partners at the Latino Policy Institute could talk about why housing affordability was an issue for the people that they're working with, or looking specifically at women in housing, and so that organizations that are working with women can talk about housing affordability, and then also bringing in the business community and sort of working with chambers of commerce to talk about why housing affordability matters in terms of their small businesses trying to attract workers to our state of Rhode Island. So for us, in terms of connecting the dots, we think about it from the communications perspective of having non-housers talk more about the work that we're doing and housing affordability and how it's affecting their bottom line.
Thanks, Nicole. And I think that actually speaks to one of the questions that we got from Twitter about how can housers better educate the general public and how federal and local governments can improve housing affordability, and that sort of having non-traditional messengers might be an effective way of doing that. Does anybody else want to sort of weigh in on effective strategies to communicate with the general public, Howard, from your experience at the state and local level? Did we lose you, Howard?
I think he's muted.
Okay.
You might have lost him.
I think, Howard, maybe you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, here we go.
There you are.
Anyway, it's important. It's always important to talk to the business community on several levels. It's important to talk to the local chambers of commerce. It's important to talk to the people who are in the neighborhood business districts about the importance of housing, and to get them to talk about it. It's been important in the passage of housing legislation in a number of different areas to see the support of the chambers. We see a lot of that out in California right now. Beyond the chambers, you see a lot of the new companies, the tech companies, Google, LinkedIn, etc., talking about how do we build housing that our employees can afford. So you have to talk about it in terms of workforce. You have to talk about it in terms of the percentage of income that people are paying for rent and what that displaces in terms of their choices in buying food and buying clothing and making other important decisions. So the business community is an important player and an important partner.
Great, thanks. So we have another question from Google, question about fair housing. Unfortunately, many conversations around housing don't include fair housing as it relates to affirmatively further fairing housing and disparate impact. And I wondered if anybody wants to explicitly address fair housing as an issue and what we learned.
Yeah, well, I think one piece of it certainly is affirmatively furthering fair housing is crucial and goes by many other names that are less wonky than that, one of them being inclusionary zoning, and we need to make sure that inclusionary zoning is something that is done in a thoughtful way, that you need to make sure that it doesn't actually completely stifle development. But one of the amazing things about increased residential density in the suburbs is that it has actually been shown to be causally connected to greater African American opportunities in the suburbs. So increased residential density is huge in suburban areas, and making sure that that's possible, whether it is through an actual inclusionary zoning program or just through the removal of regulatory barriers to the development of multifamily or small lot developments in the suburbs. That's a tremendously important way of addressing fair housing. And we also did ask about the preferences of how much diversity people want in the neighborhoods where they live, and we found a huge desire to live in communities with a mix of ages, and a quite large but a little lower desire to live in communities with a mix of cultures and ethnic backgrounds, and really people that are not necessarily like you. So there is a vocal portion of the public that may call out about not wanting to live in a more diverse area, but that's not the American public writ large.
Interesting. So we've got about 5 more minutes for questions, and there's a desire to hear a little bit about a more diverse set of housing options, one being manufactured housing as well as other forms of ownership for asset building. So, Ethan, do you want to take that one?
Sure, happy to talk about it. I think we do have in this country sort of a limited mental set of options. We think about either you're renting an apartment or you're buying a house. And there are a few places where you think about, well, maybe I'm buying an apartment, right, if you live in New York City or San Francisco. But generally speaking, we don't automatically think about the mix of tenures in between those. And those can provide opportunities for more affordability and some more flexibility in maintaining affordability as an option in communities over time. So you may have heard the terms shared equity, shared appreciation, community land trust. These are all means by which some of the value in the land, the thing that increases in value over time, can be preserved for affordability going forward. You have to find the right fit for the right community. It's not an answer everywhere, but it really can be an effective tool when used in the right places. Similarly, manufactured housing, if done right, can be a great way to create very affordable homes, right? When you build modularly and in a manufactured way, the costs are way lower. The challenge historically with manufactured housing has been the way it's been financed, that you rent the pad and you buy the home, which means the thing you own declines in value over time, and the thing you rent rises in value over time, and the math doesn't work very well. So there are good ways to finance manufactured housing in a sustainable way, so it's not a wasting asset, it's an appreciating asset, using some of those techniques of shared equity or nonprofit ownership of a manufactured housing park or community land trust ownership, things like that. The basic idea is you're sharing among a group some of the appreciation in the land while allowing the household to also share some of that appreciation. So it can still be a way to build assets and save over time, although maybe not at the same fast pace as if you own the whole thing, but allows you to step into it at a lower cost point.
And on both shared equity and other approaches, one of the things that I think is really important is we get into these niches of having affordable housing and workforce housing, and then this mixed tenure stuff that a lot of people outside of the groups that do it don't really understand what it is, and then this full range of market rate. What I think is tremendously important in making sure that we have a full range of housing options for everybody in our communities, and that we have unsubsidized affordable housing, and the types of housing that end up paying in lieu fees to support affordable housing is to make sure that we're, in general, working as a full housing community to make sure that we are getting the amount of development that we need to meet the needs of the American people. And ultimately, that's going to require us all to work together and not be infighting around different programs, and just allow us all to thrive.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And also, sort of, what we know of the work that we've done, or that folks on this call, on this Google chat that we're doing here today, all this work that's been done to really develop many different models of how we can meet the housing needs for folks, and how do we lift those up. And I think to that point, one of the questions is that we've gotten from Twitter, and I'm going to tweak it slightly so it's a little bit broader, but how do we develop messages that are resonate and convince the public more broadly, and politicians, for housing as wealth building, for housing as improving health outcomes, and improving sort of economic mobility for everyone? How can we think differently about how we talk about all these various different housing programs and interventions and ideas and strategies in a way that that has a sort of approach that highlights just the overall importance of the work that everybody's doing? I don't know, does anybody want to jump in?
Yeah, related to that, one thing with respect to wealth building is we have seen a slight uptick in the amount of people who think that homeownership is a good long-term investment. So in 2014, 50% of people thought it was a good investment, whereas 43% thought that homeownership was no longer a good long-term investment. And that's fairly close. I think that reflects a lot of concerns people had about the stability of the housing market. This year, people are a little more optimistic about wealth building. It went up to 56%, but that's not an overwhelming majority. I think people are still uneasy, feeling the aftershocks of the housing market crisis. But and the second part of your question was,
what are some of the ways that we can sort of lift up the messages that some of which you tested that sort of make the case in a broad sense about the way that housing matters, and not it doesn't become, what to Maya's point about the sort of individual strategies and interventions and programs, but that overall says we need to come together around a housing policy agenda.
Well, one thing is, emphasizing and sharing the sort of research findings that you've already got. I mean, 81%, it's all over my Twitter world, which I call my nerdiverse. But like 81% of Americans think that housing affordability is a problem. So this is, what politician is not going to want to do what 81% of the population apparently thinks needs some addressing. So, whatever the range of solutions is going to be different in different communities, and us recognizing and, kind of working together really as a full housing community to say what some communities need is higher quality housing, and it's going to be market rate housing, and that's fine because that's the unmet need in that area. And in this other area, they need a mix of market rate and of affordable. And so we're going to make sure that they get both. But really just sharing this whole idea that like 81% of the public thinks that housing affordability is some kind of a problem, that's huge. And we should all be, shouting and sharing that, and shouting and sharing the ways that housing matters, and that all the great work that the MacArthur Foundation has funded over the years. It's shows tremendously the importance of safe and stable and high quality housing.
I completely agree with that. And again, I think that a huge key is also going to be empowering other messengers. I mean, you go into schools and talk to teachers, or you go and talk to pediatricians. I mean, they understand the connection of housing with outcomes in their issue areas, but they're not necessarily empowered to talk about it. And so however we can share data or connect the dots or encourage them to speak about how housing affordability or how unhealthy housing are affecting the people that they work with every day, and that they can talk to their policymakers about, or they can share with their communities, again, is just going to magnify the message.
Hear, hear.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have. And I really want to thank Nicole, Howard, Ethan for chiming in from their computers, and to Corrie and Maya for their great work on these surveys, and to all of you for participating in today's discussion on how we can use this great evidence to elevate the issues that we all care about and are working on. So thank you again, and thank you for participating in the Google chat. Thanks.